Through this series of lectures based on the book Back to Reality, a revision of the scientific worldview, I posit that nature, the whole universe, is one grand unity without demarcation line between microscopic and cosmic, or living and lifeless, or natural and artificial. Indeed, data do not reveal such divisions. Distributions of all kinds are comparably skewed. For example, big fish are far fewer than small ones. Big boulders are far fewer than small stones. We cannot say from the data alone whether the distribution represents fish or stones. Numbers without units, curves without labels, and graphs without legends do not distinguish between living and non-living. We make up that distinction ourselves. When we make a distinction despite there being none, it may well be that we are pondering mysteries that do not exist. The problem of life origin comes to nothing by recognizing that there is no division between the animate and inanimate, but all processes comply with the same natural law. Everywhere quanta move such that the imbalances level off in the least time. For instance, both speciation and erosion progress in the same way. The universal principle is one, only mechanisms are many. Even though there is no principal difference, it's practical to classify things. Already Galileo noted that the weights of various mammals present the same mathematical relation to the thickness of their bones. The flight speeds of insects, birds, and airplanes are likewise proportional to their weights. This power law covers weights that range from about 10 milligrams for a housefly to more than 500,000 kilograms for an Airbus 380 aircraft. In this fashion, Darcy Thompson illustrated a similarity between biological and mechanical forms in his peerless book On Growth and Form, 1917. The Scottish biologist and mathematician was convinced that a more general principle than evolution by natural selection directs development into those ubiquitous patterns. Another hint toward the fundamental equality of the living and the non-living is the unresolved difficulty in defining life. Is a virus alive, given that it cannot reproduce without a host? Then again, what can? An animal needs an ecosystem. A local store needs a neighborhood. Reproduction and speciation are not exclusive hallmarks of life either. Neither are adaptation nor differentiation. For example, there is an increasing diversity of household items that are fit for various and changing habits, just as there is a diversity of animals and plants that are fit for various and changing habitats. Unity has no clear-cut boundaries, but engulfs everything. Hence, reductionism does not make sense. Already Darwin was keenly aware of the ambiguity entailed in categorizing, as he commented, "I was much struck how entirely vague and arbitrary is the distinction between species and varieties. Today we know that even a one quantum is enough to move an object, say a particle, from one category to another. A single quantum of light may trigger a sensation by converting a retinal molecule in your eye from the cis isomer to the trans isomer." Taxonomy is not just boring sorting, for we grasp reality according to the way we group and order it. Changes in classification entail changes in our worldview. Since the natural and synthetic are both outcomes of processes, there are no impermeable borders to protect us. For instance, could artificial intelligence evolve like our own intelligence and eventually even defeat us? From this holistic perspective, future is only a matter of time. Ancient atomism spells out a seamless unity of living and non-living. Many a mythology tells the same story. Neither does thermodynamics make a difference between the two. While contemporary science has come to hold the animate and inanimate to be the same, it nonetheless continues to uphold disciplinary boundaries. Not only living, but everything is in evolution toward a balance. A plant grows toward light because in that way matter seeks a balance with light. A stone falls to ground because in that way the vacuum tends toward equilibrium. As Henri Poincaré, mathematician, physicist, at one time the head of the French Academy of Sciences, put it, the aim of science is not things in themselves, as the dogmatists in their simplicity imagine, but the relations between things. Even so, when contrasting the Amazon rainforest with the Atacama Desert, it may be hard for us to imagine that substance simply adapts to the prevailing conditions. While the quantitative differences are enormous, qualitatively there is none. Matter has evolved into diversity here on Earth, whereas on Mars it has stalled in scarcity. Not only organic, but also inorganic matter on Earth has evolved, and in a short time, now that the circumstances have become amenable. Elevated manufacturing temperatures have transformed silicon, the second most common element in the Earth's crust, to the main component of artificial intelligence. Similarly, carbon once took up its position as the main component of life. What do we see when we see purpose in life? Are we impressed by the strength, adaptability, or perhaps beauty of living beings? Are we amazed by the modularity, symmetry, or some other attribute of an economical feature in the creature? Do not these and other characteristics only tell us about the organism's ability to consume free energy, that is, evolve along the lines of force? We tend to associate purpose with design, since we design things, tools, and machines for their intended uses. However, are our objectives any different from the universal aim for balance? For example, the weights and fuel consumption of four-wheeled vehicles from a beach buggy to mining truck are distributed in the same skew manner as weights and metabolic rates of different mammals. Crane trucks and giraffes are few, whereas cars and antelopes are abound. The grand regularity is self-evident. Is it too obvious for us to ask for its cause or seek its explanation? We regard a product as being poorly designed if it does not fulfill its purpose. Such goods and gadgets are dumped, and others are tried out until a good one is found. Does not everything develop in the same way too? A species evolves without knowing where and when and how to attain balance in its environment. A rivulet winds its way to the sea without knowing where the sea is. There are several examples where similar functional forms have evolved from different starting points. Birds, bats, and then insects fly but use different kinds of wings. The course of evolution is not always evident, but some forces always drive it. Chemical energy has guided and still guides the development of bats and birds, as well as other creatures. The bat has its flying membrane, and the bird has its wings to get food. However primitive, the primordial flipper was better than nothing. However simple, a prototype is much better than nothing to meet demand. The convergent courses of events are typical not only of animates, but also apply to an evolution of household goods. Glass and plastic bottles, as well as aluminium cans, serve much the same purpose, although each of them is optimal for a particular needs. Similarly, the meanings of some words are converging while others are diverging. Evolution is evidently not a random process, but takes its course along the lines of force. As the motion affects its own course, this teleology is neither goal-oriented nor designed. The eye was not designed for seeing, but developed to allow organisms to access food and other resources in light. Conversely, the eye became unnecessary when nutrition was found only in the dark, of which some bat and cavefish species are glaring examples. In this light, we see that evolution at all levels of natural hierarchy moves along the lines of force, irrespective of what those forces are. Darwin devoted an entire chapter on the origin of species by means of natural selection to the development of the eye. He reasoned that for an organisms, even a slight ability to sense light was better than nothing, and minor improvements, one after another, eventually converged into an advanced eye. In flat forms, the light-sensitive detector is at its simplest merely a nerve cell surrounded by pigment cells. It stands to reason that the eye as a sensory organism developed before the brain. If there were not already sensations, what would the brain have had to process? Even today, signals propagate from the eye of an octopus directly to its tentacles, so that no time is wasted in processing visual perceptions while the prey might escape. Signals from optical cells of an elevator door are likewise directed to door control, so that no time is wasted in processing while someone might get caught between the doors. We too act unconsciously, that is to say by reflex, to make a narrow escape. The thermodynamic theory makes sense of evolution on all scales by covering the whole spectrum of changes in one direction or another. Energy differences of whatever kind will decrease in the least time. Many different mechanisms, such as organisms with eyes and doors with photocells, expedite the consumption of free energy.
What is evolution?
Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton, already understood that evolution by natural selection is a statistical theory by nature. But it remained unclear until today that the statistic summarizes causal rather than random processes. Evolution does not only creep forward little by little, one mutation after another, but also leaps when opportunity knocks. Stephen Jay Gould and Niles Eldredge refer to this intermediate course of events as punctuated equilibrium. Punctualism contrasts with gradualism, the view that evolution is a gradual process. The truth lies on both sides of the scientific controversy. Evolution leaps when free energy pours into the system. Conversely, evolution stalls when free energy runs out. The sudden changes of state are analogous to the phase transition between solid, liquid, and gas, while the gradual changes parallel continual processes, like the increasing of temperature in a phase. Realizing that biological evolution is no different from other courses of events, we can understand life more profoundly than in the limited terms of biology. Various processes happen in the same way, but only employ different mechanisms. A beneficial mutation, like a technological innovation, makes things happen more rapidly than before. The primary form of an insect was a major innovation at the beginning of the Devonian period. This success story is repeated in the multiple and diverse types of insects that have followed. Similarly, the airplane was a significant innovation. Its triumph is reiterated in many kinds of aircraft. Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution, claimed the Ukrainian-American evolutionary biologist Theodosius Tuchansky in 1973. What is evolution all about? Leibniz called kinetic energy a living force, vis viva, and potential energy a dead force, vis mortua. Émile du Châtelet, also a notable natural philosopher of the era, recognized that in every change In a developmental phase, just in an evolutionary step, energy will change. These flows of energy carried by quanta from an organism to its environment or vice versa are typical of, but not unique to, the living. Maupertuis's principle of least action mathematizes all these transformations. In the history of science, Maupertuis is recognized as a pioneer of evolutionary theory. He maintained that survival is neither random nor prearranged, but a consequence of selection by nature. Maupertuis was among the first to examine populations instead of individuals. He understood the principle of heredity, the evolution of species, and statistical variation. Moreover, Maupertuis noticed that dogs and mice alike could become immune to the scorpion poison, a piece of knowledge from which Louis Pasteur benefited a century later. Maupertuis must have thought about also of the spontaneous birth of life, abiogenesis, for he asked the French naturalist Georges-Louis Comte de Buffon, together with the British scientist John Needham, to put under the microscope not only samples containing microbes, but just plain water. Maupertuis understood biology, but did biologists understand Maupertuis' reasoning? Some 100 years later, when The Origin of Species appeared, biology began to distance itself from natural philosophy and became a subject in its own right. The principled and persistent objection of evolutionary theory has not hit the mark, but the prevailing doctrine is in denial too. It is curiously circular reasoning to say that the most viable forms are naturally selected to continue life. By contrast, Maupertuis straightforwardly argued that evolution is neither ruled by divine force nor random choice, but takes the course of least action. Biology is too narrow a subject to win by its own means in controversies over worldviews. In truth, there is nothing in biological evolution as such worth defending, because the grand regularity emerges from all kinds of processes. The puzzle of life origin is not about life, it's about missing teleology. We have been taught that evolution is a result of random mutations and the fall of a rock is a deterministic event, not that both are manifestations of one and the same law. Without such a holistic comprehension, contemporary science focuses on means rather than motives. So we ask how life came about rather than why it emerged. No theory of history or evolution can do without teleology, that is, without an explanation, logos, through purpose, telos. To all appearances, chemistry and physics fall short in explaining life. Most notably its key characteristics of self-organization, complexity, and emergence. Thus, the old dichotomy between the animate and inanimate, no matter how decisively denied, reassert itself insofar physics fails to explain the flow of time. Random variation is a core concept of evolutionary theory. But is there truly random variation without any cause? This would require a change without any force, that is a miracle. Then again, a cause along the lines of force may give an impression of a preset goal, a fixed plan, a specific purpose. However, are not the causes of nature selecting for efficiency rather than an ultimate goal? Don't we regard many a process as more meaningful when it happens faster? The same logic applies to molecules such as enzymes and catalysts. Evolution naturally selects its course along the lines of force, geodesics as they say, so that free energy is consumed in the least time. As life evolves, the conditions for life keep evolving too, and hence the balance or the goal cannot be known beforehand. This is teleology without a preset final goal. Only in balance there is no purpose, as the goal has then been reached. Darwin pondered about the origin of life in a letter to his friend Joseph Hooker, a botanist and an explorer. Publicly, however, he refrained from suggesting abiogenesis, since his contemporaries had a lot to digest in the world-shattering, or rather world-uniting idea that all living beings have a common ancestors. For many, it might have seemed all inconceivable that light and electrochemical reactions in a little warm bond would have engendered simple compounds which would have led to ever more complex ones as the substance worked its way over the eons toward the full spectrum of life. The idea of the primordial soup as the cradle of life was not forgotten. Alexander Oparin argued in the 1930s that there is no profound difference between living and lifeless matter. Rather than speculating, the chemistry graduate Stanley Miller decided to experiment with the autonomous genesis of life in the laboratory. His supervisor, the Nobel laureate Harold Urey, shouldered the costs. Since his discovery of deuterium, a hydrogen isotope, Urey had moved to contemplate the conditions that might have prevailed on the young Earth. The experiment, carried in 1952, was intended to mimic them. After a few weeks of electrical discharging into a mixture of gases typical of an early Earth's marine atmosphere, complex organic compounds such as amino acids formed from simple organic substrates. However, nothing more alive than these building blocks of proteins were found in the reaction chamber. What then was realistically expected? The quest for balance drives chemical reactions forward, just like other events. The conditions of the Miller-Urey experiment were adequate only for what was produced. Many planets lack material sufficient even for this outcome. The Finnish philosopher Oiva Ketonen reasoned that the time for a living cell to evolve from a soup of amino acids could not be shortened to the laboratory scale. From that standpoint, life emerged as soon as possible. The nucleic acids, DNA and RNA, as well as the metabolic ATPI molecules, which all are central to life, absorb sunlight exceptionally well. This makes sense in terms of thermodynamics. Such compounds became enriched because they quickly raised the energy content of early substances toward that of the sunlight. In universal terms, natural selection does not necessitate genes and their mutations. Rather, nucleic acids develop into these powerful mechanisms we know today as genes to consume free energy. While key players, genes are not the prerequisites, but the products of evolution. The history of life is imprinted in these molecules of life in the same way that the past of an ancient culture can be read in the pieces of its pottery. We may never unravel the detailed course of abiogenesis, just as we may never be able to figure out the fate of a long-lost people. In a language, the origin of letters is still discernible. The origin of life are also discernible in the basis of DNA. For instance, the letter A initially stood for bull's head. The letter B symbolized a house with rooms. H delineated fence. By now, the meanings have changed. A is not just the symbol of the valuable bull. The base is no longer just an excellent antenna for photons. Drawing parallels, we grasp that how life began or how a life arose is a moot question. There is no definite beginning, no decisive moment in a step-by-step process. The power of the universal principle is that it puts special questions into the general context. Although things remain the same, the perspective is more comprehensive than before. Boltzmann struggled for 30 years to find the equation of evolution, but paradoxically, he failed to discern the dynamics because he knew the end state. In 1872, he succeeded in deriving the expression for a balance of gas molecules. However, in that equation, there are no any forces, no trace of them that brought the gas into the thermodynamic balance in its surroundings. For at balance, the sum of forces is zero. The root of the problem was noted by Boltzmann's friend Joseph Loschmidt. The professor of physical chemistry wondered how an equation that is symmetric with respect to the time could possibly describe the flow of time. Furthermore, the German mathematician Ernesto Zermelo remarked that according to the Boltzmann equation, a system that has once been in a state of imbalance will return to the same state of imbalance. Such things do not happen. The issues raised by Loschmidt and Zermelo concern likewise other equations in which energy is constant. Such equations do not explain the leveling of imbalance, they only model the condition of balance.
Why are the molecules of life single-handed?
Louis Pasteur was one of the first who noticed that many natural compounds lack mirror images, whereas a chemical synthesis yields a mixture of right and left-handed compounds. For example, all essential amino acids are left-handed. Many natural sugar molecules have no mirror image counterparts either. While single-handed compounds are therefore regarded as a signature of life, the origin of handedness remains a mystery. The thermodynamic theory recognizes single-handedness not only in compounds but also in shaking with right hand and driving on the right-hand side of the road. Bolts too are usually right-handed, as are corkscrews. Our society is imbued with copious standards to make it function efficiently. In general, the stronger the network of interactions in a system, the higher the degree of standardization. For example, the global economy becomes more and more standardized as it becomes more and more integrated. Yet integration is not an end in itself because standardization by its very nature whittles down diversity. That is, means to make things happen. As everything affects everything, the optimum degree of standardization cannot be known beforehand, but it has to be sought. In this way, we understand that the primordial standardization of biochemistry is in principle no different from the harmonization of contemporary economies with industrial standards. Whether it's two molecules or two animal species, two human beings or two products, services or companies, only one will survive unless either develops away from consuming a common source of free energy. It is like a tug war. The winner takes it all. Thus, the homochirality of a natural compounds does not suggest a single origin of life. Instead, it's an indication of the unity in the biosphere. Many a problem results from isolating the system of interest from the whole of which it is a part. The question of why natural substances are single-handed arose and persists because the object of study is detached from its environment and history. In the test tube, the energetic difference between the compound and its mirror image is negligible. Under those reduced circumstances, there is no cause for homochirality, and hence its occurrence seems a puzzle. Similarly, there is hardly any evidence of those primordial events where matter instead of antimatter became the standard of substance. But the cause of standardization is clear and certain: the quest for balance in the least time.
Why is the genome cluttered with dross?
The entire human genome was mapped in the early 2000s. The sequence in over 3 billion base pairs crowned the work that began in 1953 when Francis Crick and James Watson deciphered the structure of a piece of a DNA. Back then, the beautiful double helix pointed to genetic determinism. But today, we recognize a role of epigenetic non-determinism. Non-determinism means that the development cannot be predicted, not even in principle, for everything depends on everything else. Epigenetic in turn means that not only do the genes determine the phenotype of an organism alone, but also the environment exerts a heritable impact. Already in 1940s, the British biologist Conrad Waddington reasoned that the epigenetic landscape imposes changes on the genome that in turn mold the landscape of development. For example, changes in culture may facilitate the evolution of a genome, and its evolution may subsequently precipitate cultural changes. Causes and consequences intermingle as cooperation asks for the ability to communicate, and that ability supports collaboration. Today, as we are drowning in data, we are thirsty for a theory that organizes all observations. But biological research is in crisis, as Sidney Brenner put it bluntly in 2012. The Nobel Prize winning South African biologist went on his Nature paper. Although many believe that more is better, history tells us least is best. In their legendary paper, Crick and Watson wrote, "It has not escaped our notice that the specific pairing we have postulated immediately suggests possible copying mechanism for the genetic material. The complementary DNA strands hinted at how the genome duplicates. Similarly, the mirror image structures of the electron and the positron imply how matter annihilates with antimatter. One really knows to put one's hand in a glove and one's foot in a shoe. While complementary structures propose pairing, many forms of nature are too complicated to disclose at first glance their purpose. In other words, what will happen." Crick and Watson took for granted that DNA is an instruction. It remained only to crack the code, to figure out which set of bases correspond to which amino acids. This mission was completed by the end of the 1960s. The cell seemed like a machine, undeniably complicated, but basically controlled by genetic information. Well, at least many wanted to see the cell that way. However, the modern worldview had been challenged even earlier. In the late 1950s, biochemist John Kendrew and a molecular biologist Max Perot succeeded for the first time in determining the structures of two proteins with almost atomic precision. But the outcomes were not at all as expected. Unlike DNA, the structures of the myoglobin and hemoglobin did not disclose how these molecules function. Crick understood the gravity of the problem straight away and left for California and switched from molecular biology to brain research. Even today, it's difficult to figure out function from a single molecular structure, as it requires knowledge of the structures at different stages along the chain of events. When all of them have finally been worked out, what is it left for a theory to predict? In the 1960s, genetic determinism was already in trouble. It turned out that the genome does not only consist of instructions for the cell to synthesize its peptides, but mostly comprises seemingly superfluous segments. These sections were quickly dubbed junk DNA by Susumu Ono, an American-Japanese geneticist and evolutionary biologist. Genes make up less than 2% of the human genome. What else is all the rest for? It's also puzzling that even though the genome size varies between organisms by over 1,000-fold, it's independent of organisms' complexity. The C-value paradox demonstrates itself so that the genomes of some protozoans are much larger than ours, and correspondingly the portion of genes much smaller. From the thermodynamic perspective, the genome is like any other system. It is not an inert instruction, but a living system. For instance, gene products in the genome are responsible for most of cellular metabolism in the same way that trees in a forest are responsible for most of the energy metabolism of an ecosystem. While the fallen trunk does not surprise us any more than pseudogenes, figuring out all the functions of detritus in a forest would be as tedious as revealing all the purposes of a bits of a genome. Junk is marginally functional, but functional nonetheless, as everything participates in something. Polypores, lichens, and fungi live on the trunks and branches of trees dead and alive alike. Various independent and moving genomic elements live next to the genes. Our genomes differ from each other as one thicket differs from another. Tiny differences are numerous. Nevertheless, scientists imagine that some of them would cause common diseases. By contrast, they would hardly think that variations in twigs would be responsible for pests invading one forest while leaving another intact, but also consider factors beyond the forest, such as the weather, in the hopes of finding the cause of the plague. Indeed, it has now become apparent that individual differences between genomes do not mean much, if anything, in causing common diseases. It's the whole that matters. The prevailing perception of relations between genes and diseases is incomplete. Small differences in the genome explain only little about why one catches a disease while another does not. Genetic details, such as those accountable for human height, distribute in the same way as other quantitative traits that affect diseases, say diabetes and autoimmune diseases or cholesterol levels. Genomic diversity is as comprehensible as biodiversity in an ecosystem or diversity in an economy. There are many kinds of forests, as there are all sorts of genomes. Species richness in tropical thickets is as uncharted as are the contents of a large genomes. Conversely, dry heathlands are scant in diversity as the genome of bladderwort, where only few percent seem to be superfluous. Both the abundance and scarcity of species in a forest genome and an economy are consequences of the prevailing conditions and history. A piece of DNA seems like a verse of poetry. When we manage to decode it, we expect to be soon reading the entire book of life. Instead, we ended up facing the spectrum of genomic life. Over generations, the elements mount up in a genome like mementos on a mantelpiece. One may thus accumulate a rich genome, just as one may acquire a vast inheritance. For example, our genes hold hints of famines that past generations endured. Perhaps now our lifestyle is engraving therein a mark of overabundance.
Why reproduce sexually?
Despite the comprehensiveness of evolutionary theory, Darwin felt that natural selection as such does not explain sexual selection. An attractive appearance not only favors mating, but also invites predators. For example, the bird of paradise signals its fitness with a long tail, which then again makes flying arduous. Although the tension between motives is evident, yet a balance will be found because energy is the universal measure, even for seemingly incommensurable items in the pans of the balance. Sexual reproduction is associated with an additional cost. If only females give birth, what need is there for males? Although mixing parents' genetic material by recombination produces variations for natural selection, the male of many species seems redundant after fertilization. It could even be a burden on its own offspring by consuming resources. As a matter of fact, the females of some spider species eat the males after mating. Of course, females and males must meet to mate, which by taking its time slows down reproduction. Against such a backdrop, it is perplexing why sexual reproduction has survived throughout evolution. It is also difficult to explain, using the theory of evolution, why worms have both female and male gametes, or why many plant species have pistils and stamens in the same individual. More remarkable than hermaphroditism is that female races can, as they grow old, transform into males. The purpose of sexuality seems more diverse than mere reproduction. For instance, many primates, like us humans, exhibit sexuality for solidarity, but also use it for suppression and violence. Sexuality is perplexing in its pervasiveness and ambiguity. What do we talk about when we talk about sex? We can understand a complex spectrum of reproduction from genes to behavior through the thermodynamic theory. Recombination and genomic duplication, that is mitosis, as well as mating and social interactions, are all processes. It depends on circumstances whether speed or endurance is vital, whether variation or specialization is needed, whether wisdom or some other factor is required for things to happen. Species at the top of the food chains reproduce sexually. There they need comprehensive ability to consume various resources. We human beings have diversified into the most varied environments, whereas species at the bottom of the food chains do not even have many assets to vary. For them, sexuality would be more of a disadvantage. All in all, sexual reproduction, just as asexual kind, is a mechanism to let things happen. Yet there is no universal way of easing up all tensions. For instance, some germ cells of plants are naturally sterile because in that way sexual cellular proliferation and asexual mitochondrial propagation are in dynamic balance, like a bow and a string. If we only examine one aspect, we see the imbalance and stare at the tension in wonder. The environment influences organisms' mode of reproduction. A prime example is the aphid's annual shift from asexual to sexual reproduction and back. Over the spring and summer, the asexual phase prevails. Maupertuis marveled at this hectic prolific phase where no one has time for romantic candlelight dinners. In the fall, aphids switch to sexual reproduction. Mating supplies eggs with genetic variation, and the aerial display of the winged aphids yields spatial diversity as they settle down in various wintering places. Some eggs are hence bound to survive, and larvae will again hatch in the spring. In greenhouses and temperate climate zones, aphids reproduce only asexually. Sexual populations have vanished because energy flows faster through parthenogenesis than through sexual reproduction. There is no reason to contrast sexual selection that emphasizes reproduction with natural selection that favors viability in general, but all reasons to describe everything in the universal terms of energy and time. A handsome tail or an awesome sports car as such hardly charms a partner, but signals that if one can afford such a luxury, a lot more must be within reach, including truly necessary things. In sexual selection, as in other choices, the reality may well turn out to be something other than what is apparent at a first impression. When feathers molt or the rental contract is annulled, the partner might just fly away.
Is there extraterrestrial life?
The question about life in the universe has advanced from sheer speculation to science as powerful telescopes have succeeded in spotting exoplanets, perhaps even those that could harbor life. But even earlier, scientists have been looking for telltales of extraterrestrial life. A big meteorite fell on September 28, 1969, near Murchison, a small village in Western Australia. Over 100 kilograms of carbonaceous stones that came from down from the sky were collected. These samples have since been studied. Over 10,000 compounds, including 70 amino acids, have been identified, but there is no unambiguous marker of life, say molecular homochirality. Despite inconclusive evidence, the meteorite brought back the old idea of panspermia. Could life have been spread in the cosmos by meteors, asteroids, and comets? In this way, the question of how life was born is replaced by the question how life was sown here on Earth. The transport hypothesis also gives the impression that life is a superficial phenomenon on the face of the Earth. Thermodynamic theory offers a different view, maintaining that our planet is alive in its entirety. The idea of a living planet is not all that new either. In Greek mythology, Gaia personifies Earth. The deity was born from chaos. The Gaia hypothesis came alive anew in the mind of James Lovelock in 1960s. At that time, Lovelock was working for NASA on a project to discover life on Mars. Based on the very different atmospheric composition of Mars and Earth, Lovelock suggested that the Earth is a superorganism. It regulates itself as an animal regulates its vital processes. The biosphere is entwined in life-sustaining interactions with atmosphere, hydrosphere, and geosphere. According to thermodynamics, Mars is not entirely lifeless either. Its white polar caps on the carbon dioxide live in tune with seasonal changes, just as the geosphere, hydrosphere, biosphere, and atmosphere of our blue orb cohere with the seasons too. A response of any kind is a part of a planetary process, but the interaction network on a red planet is sparse and thin compared with that of our home planet. Lovelock's Gaia idea pleased environmentalists immediately, but was only slowly acknowledged by the academia. Among others, the scientists W.4 Doolittle, Richard Dawkins, and Stephen Jay Gould asked, albeit later reconsidered, how natural selection acting on rival organisms could possibly lead to a planetary balance, global homeostasis. In the face of fluctuations, the terrestrial free energy minimum state is stable in the same way as our physiological state is, well, while not being invulnerable to severe stress. Lovelock did not resort to the general thermodynamic principle, but a simple computer model when defending his view of global self-regulation. In this daisy world simulation, light and dark daisies grow on the surface of a fictitious planet. The light ones reflect radiation, whereas the dark ones absorb it. The flowers are otherwise identical and grow best at the same constant temperature. On a planet orbiting an ever-brightening star, when left alone, the dark flowers initially gain ground and then cede the dominance to the white ones. During this transition, the planet remains at almost constant temperature, despite the intensifying insolation. Eventually, the planet is fully shrouded with all white daisies, but even that is not enough to totally reflect the increasing radiation. As the temperature explodes out of control, the flowers wilt away. The thermodynamics yields the same scenario as what the one Lovelock simulated. The vegetation adapts to the ice ages and warm periods. After such disturbances, the system finds a balance anew. However, the greater the damage, the slower the recovery, and the system cannot necessarily recover from devastation when it's already struggling to survive at its limits of its regulatory power. As the daisy world model demonstrates, vegetation is a response to sunlight. The eradication of natural vegetation, especially the rainforest, therefore invites catastrophe. The destruction of the most effective regulatory mechanisms of the global homeostasis at the same time as greenhouse gases are released in increasing amounts will cause insurmountable problems. These conclusions are not unheard of. and yet doubt persists among some. But there is no room for speculation because the thermodynamic theory keeps track of every single quantum. We are on our way out of the frying pan into the fire when forests are felled for food and biofuel plantations. The issue is not only about the forest harvesting carbon from the atmosphere, but about the full effects of vegetation. When heat no longer flows properly to the upper atmosphere, the rain does not fall on the large areas as before. Hot deserts expand, seas warm up, and glaciers shrink. Preserving mechanism, specifically tropical forests, mediating the most voluminous flows of energy, are the most critical in countering climate change. Do Earth-like exoplanets harbor life? Well, we do not know. First, we need to decide what to look for. Since there is no qualitative difference between the living and non-living, we simply must choose what we call life. That is how we go about answering this question here on our home planet too. We're also looking for intelligent extraterrestrial life, yet, as it seems, without understanding what life is. Picking up an alien broadcast would be shocking, for we would not capture it by chance. Unfocused signals such as TV and radio transmissions degrade too much on their cosmic voyages. Nonetheless, other worlds are always far away in the future or in the past, since nothing implies there to be a courier faster than light. Messages even from orbiters of the nearest stars will arrive after a generation or two has passed here on Earth. Our time is our limit. It forces us to think differently. Above all, our lives here on Earth. It is unlikely, improbable, energetically unfavorable that events on an exoplanet would have led to the same standards as here on Earth. Diversification begins when connections break up. Organisms evolved into distinctive indigenous species when Australia broke off from the other continents. Similarly, the Earth would share history with an exoplanet when it comes to the elements, perhaps some simple compounds, but hardly when it comes to most metabolites. The molecules and organisms over there would undoubtedly resemble but not equate those here. The grand regularity would be on display there too, but the details would differ. Already in 1698, Christian Huygens brought this understanding to the fore in his opus Cosmotheoros. Earth's resources are abundant yet limited. The scarcity of phosphorus curtails plant growth. That's why it has to be habitually spread on fields. The shortage of rare earth metals in turn constrain economic growth. Running out of fossil fuel has worried us already for quite some time. We depend on many resources and mechanisms that characterize the Earth. In the long run, our existence requires both volcanic activity for cycling nutrients and the Earth's magnetic field to shield us from cosmic rays. On the whole, we lack the capacity to colonize other places in the universe. Transforming a desert planet into a viable habitat is beyond our means. For better or worse, we are Earthlings. We have mapped out our home planet and have now focused our telescopes on exoplanets. But for us to survive, it is essential that we realize who we are. Are we atoms, molecules, cells, bacteria, fields, forests, power plants, computer networks, or even much more? Are we in fact inseparable from our vibrant planet? The modern vision of evolution without any sight of direction is blind. We talk about genetic and epigenetic inheritance, cultural evolution, and technological development as if they were distinct and independent processes. Instead, we ought to conclude that one and the same law operates everywhere, since the regularity of data displays itself at all levels of natural hierarchy. The character of natural selection becomes apparent by asking who selects. Phrasing this question in this pointed way exposes the agent. It is the flows of quanta themselves that choose their least time paths along the lines of force. Since the living does not stand out in the data from the rest, it is logical that the theory does not make such a distinction either, but rather explains everything on the same basis, namely as natural processes.